Good afternoon. Welcome to another one of the PVFF Beginners Fly Tying Sessions. This one being the second in 2021. Today we're going to be tying the Prince Nymph. The Prince Nymph is named after its creator, a gentleman named Doug Prince, who lived in California at the time, and he tied it for one of the local fly shops. And probably in the late 1940s. Now, the one thing that is different and was unique about Doug Prince's new creation of a fly was that he used goose biots both for the wing and for the tail of this fly, which was unconventional at the time, but over the years that has proven to be a very effective way of imitating certain types of nymphs, perhaps the stoneflies in particular. But its popularity has continued for now over 50, 60 years. And I consider the Prince Nymph to be a staple in my fly tying collection, in my fly fishing collection. I learned first to use Prince Nymph when I was fishing in some of the Montana rivers. And at that point, when it was introduced to me, it was a very effective fly. And I've consequently used it on the East Coast on a number of rivers, and it is one of my favorites. So we're going to be learning how to tie that today, and I'll be talking about some of the nuances of the Prince Nymph. And one or more of the things that we're going to feature today is, again, the use of peacock curl in particular, for the abdomen of the fly. Because peacock has an iridescence that probably emulates so closely the abdomen, the sparkle quality of many of the nymph forms. So it's really one of the fundamental types of materials that we use in tying flies. We're going to be tying this one with a bead head. It can be tied without. In fact, the original Prince Nymph was tied without a bead head. But I, like a number of other fly tiers and some that you might see on the internet, always incorporate a bead. Because I think that the bead not only gives the fly, it helps it sink, but it also imparts some more motion to the fly, because it's basically the front of the fly is bobbing up and down as it's tumbling through the current. So again, you can tie this with or without a bead. Now, some tiers also add a lead wrap underneath the peacock to help the fly sink. I find that makes the fly a little too bulky, and so I prefer, if I'm going to add extra weight, first of all, as I mentioned, use tungsten bead, because it is heavier than a copper bead or brass bead. But also I will put some split shot about a foot above the fly itself in order to help it sink and have it bounce along close to the bottom, because after all, these nymphs are found along the bottom, and that's where you want your fly. Now we're also going to add a gold rib made out of thin gold wire, and that serves two purposes. The one function is that it helps hold the peacock intact and keep it from being broken by the teeth of the fish. And the other thing that rib does is it actually makes it look like it's a segmented abdomen, which all freshwater insects will have, that segmentation. We also tie a collar or beard using some hen hackle or a rooster saddle hackle, and that's what we'll use today to provide a collar on the fly. Okay, so let's get started tying our fly today. And first of all, I'd like to describe the materials that we're using for the Prince Nymph. The hook that we're going to be using is a size 12, model 7031. I buy these from the Hook Shack in New York. They're on the internet, and they've been a very, very good supplier for us to deal with. We are going to be using a copper bead. 1/8 inch is the correct size to use for a size 12 hook. A small section, about 2 inches of copper wire, and this is in size small. We're going to be using some peacock curl, as I've mentioned before, and I will note a little bit later when I'm tying that I will use 2 strands of this, and I will explain why. The beard or collar on the fly will be 1 feather from the saddle hackle. It's basically just a ginger colored hackle. The biots that we will be using, if you're not familiar with biot, it's basically, the biot is a very small edge along the flight feather of a goose or a turkey. And the fibers are very short, but they're stiff. And just one of these will allow you to tie probably 3 or 4 dozen flies. So you don't need to have many of these. I think that just about completes the different materials that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to get started. And I'm going to, first, I've already pinched down the barb on this hook. I'm going to place it into the vise. Oops, I'm sorry. First thing we need to do is put the bead onto that hook. And of course, the bead goes on through the smaller hole in the bead over the hook shank, slide it to the front, and then place that hook in the vise. I've chosen a brown 6/0 thread to use for most of the construction of the fly. At the end, I'm going to be showing you how to change off and insert what we would refer to as a hot spot on this fly, which will further attract the fish's attention. So I'm going to start the thread right behind the bead, wrap it back until I get to the bend of the hook, stopping just slightly in front of where the bend is, clipping off that excess thread, and then selecting 2 biots. And what I have found the easiest way to do that is to just flex the biot feather itself until I have several, and then I just clip them off with my scissors right down near the shank, so to speak, of the feather. I'm going to set the one aside and hold the other. Now, we want this feather to, in the rear of the fly, to stick out sort of at maybe 30 degrees. And I'll just hold up one that's finished to show you both the curvature of that tail as well as the placement of the biots. Now, we don't want that tail to be longer than the shank of the hook. So we might measure it just by holding it up next to the shank of the hook and getting the approximate length that we want. Now, what I have found, and I did a little research on the internet to see the different ways that the tail is applied to a fly such as this. I think that my method basically satisfies the same intent that other fly tyers will use. So I'm going to show you my method, even if you were to research the internet and find other ways of doing it. But I like, now that I've measured it, to hold that right on top of the hook, and at the same location, exchange the hands, make one wrap, a second wrap, and then pull down. Now that biot should be pretty much where I want it, in that place. Before I advance the thread some more, I'm going to cut off the excess part of that biot, still holding it in place so that it doesn't move around the shank of the hook. I wrap over that butt section, and as you can see, the tail is still in place. Now I bring my threads back virtually to the same place that it was originally hanging for the first buyout. I pick up another one, measure its length, change hands, putting it right on top and holding it down with my thumbnail, making 1, 2 wraps, pulling down, checking to make sure that it is in place, clipping off this excess, and then again just holding it until I've wrapped those butts down. So the tail is now in place. Next I will take a piece of copper wire that I've already pre-cut, approximately 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. I hold that on the far side of the hook away from me and begin to make thread wraps over that wire, wrapping it back. Now you might ask, why am I wrapping it on the far side? And it's so that when I do my counter wrap with the wire, I'm coming towards me and I already have the wire in place, so when the first turn is going to be at the very rear end of the hook. So now that the wire is in place, the tail's in place, again I bring my thread forward. Now, I have pre-selected 2 barbs of peacock curl, and what I'm going to do is trim off the butt end, which usually on peacock is signified by there's a little bit of white material on the end, so you can very easily distinguish between the tip and the butt end of the peacock. So I lay that right on top of the hook, begin to wrap the thread back over it until I get back to that junction of the tail, also where the wire is in place. And then I bring that forward again. At this point, it's preferable, so that you don't loosen the thread, to put 1 or 2 just half hitches or whip finishes there to hold the thread in place. So I'll do that. And now I can use the bobbin holder, swing that in place. So my hands are both free now that I'm able to begin to wrap the peacock. Now, rather than twisting the peacock, which is going to make it too dense, just hold the 2 pieces of peacock together in your hand and begin to wrap clockwise around the shank of the hook, moving forward. As we get closer to the bead, I want you to take note of where I stop. We want to leave a small space right in front of the peacock and between it and the bead. And that is going to be the location where we're going to be tying in the hackle for the beard, representing the so-called beard or collar of the fly. And it's also going to be the location where we tie in the 2 wing buyouts. So I've stopped my peacock probably 1/16 of an inch behind the bead. I've made 1 wrap of the thread over that peacock. I'll make another one behind it, 1 or 2 in front of it, and clip off that hackle. That peacock. Now I'm at the point, and again I will put in another half hitch just to secure that. And then we can begin to wrap the wire. Now remember, when we're segmenting a fly, whether it be a nymph or whether it be a dry fly or whatever, with a wire or some other material, it's providing the segmentation, but it's also reinforcing the peacock or the dubbing or whatever. And you don't want that wire to be obscured by the peacock. So So in order to do that and achieve the two effects, you want to counter wrap that. This is about the only time we counter wrap any materials on our flies. So I'm wrapping that back along the abdomen. I could be doing this with a pair of pliers or by rotating the vise, but I really don't need to do that as part of the demonstration. I will hold the end, make that last wrap, and then a couple of wraps of thread to secure the wire, and trim off that excess. Now you could helicopter it off, but I prefer using a sharp pair of needle nose pliers to achieve that. And another half hitch would not hurt at all. All right. Next thing I'm going to do, and I will leave my thread hang in this location, is we're going to be tying in the one feather. This is part of a saddle hackle, and because of the stiffness down at the butt end, I prefer using the tip to tie in the hackle on a small nymph or wet fly like this. So I'm going to grab that by its tip, and I'm going to flare the fibers as such. And then by holding the concave part down or flat against the hook, I'm just going to secure that tip with 1, 2, 3 wraps, lift it up, wraps in front. Okay, now we can either use hackle pliers or our hand to wrap that hackle around the shank of the hook. But before I do that, I'm going to pull the thread out of the way. Now, if you'll notice that each time that I turn the feather around the hook, I'm going to be stroking back on the fibers. So that's 2 turns. Perhaps 3 turns. It should be about enough. And I make 1 wrap behind that, 2nd wrap behind the feather, 1 in front, clip off the remaining butt section, clip off this tip that's been holding it in place, and then by wetting my fingers, I just draw that hackle back a little bit and make a few wraps to put it in place. As you can see now, most of these fibers are stroked back. They're being held back by those last thread wraps that I use. Now before I put the, now that I have the collar in, before I put the final biots in place, I want to trim the top of the hackle off. So in this case, the hackle is not going to interfere with the wings. And in fact, we're getting more of a beard than a full collar. So I'm just going to take my scissors and trim off the very top there. And now I go to my white biots that I will remove in much the same way that I did before. Select 2, take my scissors and just clip them off right next to the shank of that feather. I'm going to set the one aside. And again, as I did before, I'm going to be laying this across the top of the fly, no longer than the abdomen or where I had stopped the peacock. So lay that right on top, hold it in place with my thumbnail, 1, 2, 3 wraps, pulling down, Now that one is in place. I pick up the other one, make the measurement, hold it across as I did with the first, hold it in place with my thumbnail, make 2 wraps, pull them down to tighten it. Now I can also flare this up a little bit and get right in front of it with about 2 wraps. And then I can trim these off, this extra section. So at this point, everything's in place. I'm satisfied with where the biots are. I'm satisfied with the beard. I would trim just a little bit of that extra hackle off right there. Now, I'm going to do something that you might want to add as an added feature. Normally, I would finish the fly in this manner and I would apply some head cement. But before I do that, I'm going to make a few more wraps here. I'm going to tie that off and cut the thread. Now I'm going to add a little bit of a hot spot. A hot spot is something that we don't know exactly what the fish recognizes, but it may just be an attention getter. So in this particular case, I'm going to put a hot spot or just a small thread wrap right immediately behind the bead. And it's something that might trigger the fish's attention. So now that I've cut my brown thread that I was using to tie the fly, I'm going to just add a little bit of a pink color to that. And I can finish that off with a couple more wraps. Cut that. And then I'm going to take 1 drop of head cement. You might want to use a bodkin to put this on, or just a drop like that usually will suffice. And there we have our finished nymph. So I'm going to put that in one of my holders over here so that you see the contrast between one with a collar and one without. As you can see, this one has a little added feature, and all it is adding another color thread. And that thread doesn't have to be pink. It can be maybe a bright yellow or even a fluorescent green or something like that, but it's something to attract the fish's attention. And if you haven't heard the expression before, a hot spot, that's what we're referring to. Now, before we come to conclusion, I'd like to also give you some idea of what you can do to evaluate your own tying. And so, on another day when I was working through this pattern, I tied several. And I'm going to show you, in this particular case, what I would refer to in my analysis of my own flies, what I think was a fly that had a problem and flies that turned out okay. So this first one that I'm showing here, the beard or the collar that's formed by the hackle is sticking back a little too far. It should be only to the tip of the hook. This is extending back almost to the bend of the hook. So in critiquing my own fly, I found that to be a little problematic. The second one that I have here, I stopped the peacock just a little too short, giving myself more than enough space behind the bead. And so it tends to make the abdomen look a little bit sort of depressed. So that was another. In doing a self-analysis, I wouldn't necessarily reject it because In words of one of the more famous fly tyers, it's good enough to catch a fish. But I'm just talking now about self-satisfaction with your product. This one is probably ideal. The beard is the right length, the tail and wings are the right length, and the body is nice and robust, but not too much. So, as maybe many fly tyers instructors have talked about in the past, that any fly tyer, no matter what level they are, usually has to tie close to a half dozen before you're satisfied with your product. Well, I hope you enjoyed the tying session today. But before we quit for the afternoon and get out on the stream, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about how to fish a Prince Nymph, or how I fish a Prince Nymph. I have fished it unweighted, other than having the bead on it, or with a split shot about 12 inches above the fly itself. I have fished it with and without an indicator. I prefer to fish with an indicator, but not all fly fishers do. And I've also fished it in combination with a dry fly, either a large terrestrial, or one of my favorites is to use a stimulator, which is an imitation of a large stonefly. It not only gives enough buoyancy to the nymph, but it also helps sort of magnify the surface current, so that you're getting some action below the surface into the nymph. If you want a little bit more professional instruction as to how to fish the Prince Nymph, there is a video, and probably more than one, but I'll refer to one that's called How to Fish a Nymph and an Indicator, and it's a product of the Real Fly Fishers, and it's found on YouTube. I watched it the other day and found it to be very informative, and I think you would too. So wishing you success with the Prince Nymph, and looking forward to seeing you next month.